May 10, 1865, Irwinville, Georgia. 5 in the morning. Soldiers of the 4th Michigan Cavalry surrounded a small camp in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside, a man pulled a woman's shawl over his shoulders against the cold and stepped out of a tent. That man was Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, the most wanted man in the United States. When they searched him, he had a few dollars in his pocket. That was all. 6 weeks earlier, he had fled the Confederate capital of Richmond with nearly $1 million in gold, silver coins, bullion, and jewelry. Now he was standing in a Georgia swamp with almost nothing. So where did the gold go? 160 years later, nobody fully agrees on the answer. And that is exactly why we are still talking about it. To understand what was lost, you need to understand what the Confederate treasury actually was in April 1865. The Confederacy had financed its war primarily by printing paper money, enormous quantities of it. By 1865, Confederate currency had collapsed so badly that it took hundreds of paper dollars to buy what one had bought in 1861. Soldiers were being paid in money their families could barely use to buy bread. Hard currency, gold coins, silver bricks, gold bullion, was the only money that still meant anything. And by early 1865, the Confederate government had gathered everything it had left into one place. The Confederate treasury held approximately $327,000 in gold and silver, including, remarkably, floor sweepings from the Dahlonega Mint in Georgia, containing fragments of gold dust accumulated over years of coin production. The 6 major Richmond banks contributed approximately $450,000 in their own reserves. Women across the South had donated jewelry, rings, brooches, watches, some melted down, some still in their original form. Total value, somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000 in real money. Not the millions that Union newspapers claimed. Those figures were inflated deliberately to encourage soldiers to search harder. But still an enormous sum. All of it was packed into wooden crates and iron boxes on the night of April 2nd, 1865. Jefferson Davis was sitting in his pew at St. Paul's Episcopal Church that Sunday morning when an aide walked quietly down the aisle and handed him a telegram. It was from General Robert E. Lee. The Confederate defensive lines at Petersburg had broken. Union forces were pouring through. Richmond could not be held. Leave tonight or be captured. Davis left the church without a word. By nightfall, the Confederate capital was in chaos. Government officials burned documents. Citizens fled. Confederate soldiers moved through the streets in every direction at once, some marching out to cover the retreat, some simply walking away from a war they knew was over. 2 trains left Richmond Station just after midnight. The first carried Davis, his cabinet, and government records. The second carried the gold, guarded by a group of teenage naval midshipmen who had just scuttled their own ship in the James River to prevent its capture. By morning, Richmond was in Union hands, and the Confederate gold was moving south into the unknown. The trains reached Danville, Virginia, 140 miles southwest of Richmond, on the afternoon of April 3rd. Davis set up a temporary government there and issued a defiant proclamation. The war was not over. The Confederacy would fight on. Almost nobody believed him, and here, before the convoy had even left Virginia, the first piece of the gold vanishes. Among the Treasury's holdings were 39 kegs of Mexican silver dollars, coins the Confederacy had received in exchange for cotton sold to Mexico. 9,000 pounds of silver. When it became clear that Danville could not be held and the convoy would have to move south by wagon through back roads, someone made a decision. You cannot move 9,000 pounds of silver quickly through the Carolina countryside without being caught. The kegs were almost certainly buried somewhere near Danville, Virginia. They have never been found. The men who buried them either died before they could return or chose, for reasons we will never know, to stay silent for the rest of their lives. 9,000 pounds of silver. Still out there, most likely. Waiting. On April 6th, the same day Lee lost a quarter of his remaining army at the Battle of Sailor's Creek. The Treasury left Danville heading further south, moving by train where track existed and by wagon where it did not. The route took the convoy through Greensboro, North Carolina, where General Joseph Johnston was paid from the treasury to cover his soldiers' wages, then through Charlotte, then south into South Carolina, then into Georgia. At every stop, the crates got lighter, military escorts demanded payment, travel expenses mounted. Disbursements were made to soldiers who had not been paid in months. Each payment was the Confederacy trying to honor obligations it no longer had the power to keep. By the time the convoy reached Washington, Georgia on April 17th, the Confederate treasury proper had been reduced to approximately $43,000. But the Richmond bank reserves, roughly $250,000, were still largely intact. And on April 9th, while the convoy was somewhere on the road between the Carolinas and Georgia, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. Jefferson Davis refused to accept it. On May 4, 1865, Davis held the last official Confederate cabinet meeting at the Hurd House in Washington, Georgia. He formally disbanded the Confederate government. The cause was lost. Before leaving, he made two decisions about the remaining gold. Both would fuel speculation for the next century and a half. First, he handed $86,000 in gold to two Confederate Navy officials, Lieutenant James Semple and Edward Tidball. Their orders were to smuggle it to England, to the Confederate financial house of Fraser, Trenholm and Company in Liverpool. The gold was hidden in the false bottom of a carriage. Semple and Tidball took the gold and disappeared. Second, the remaining $43,000 in treasury funds was distributed directly to the soldiers of Davis's escort, approximately $26 per man, and they went home. Davis rode south with almost nothing, heading for Florida, hoping to escape to Cuba. 6 days later, the 4th Michigan Cavalry surrounded his camp before dawn, a few dollars in his pocket. The gold was gone. So what actually happened to it? There are 4 answers. All of them are at least partially true. The first answer is the boring one. Most of it was simply spent. The documented disbursements along the route from Richmond to Georgia account for the majority of the $327,000 in treasury funds. The math, when you work through it carefully, mostly adds up. A government fleeing through hostile territory costs money. This part of the story is not mysterious. It is just the quiet, unglamorous death of a treasury. The second answer is more dramatic, and it is entirely real. 19 days after Davis was captured, a Union Army escort of just 7 men was moving the Richmond bank reserves, still approximately $250,000 in gold and silver, by wagon north through Georgia toward a railroad in South Carolina. On the night of May 24, 1865, the wagons stopped to camp near the Chenal Plantation in Lincoln County, Georgia. Around midnight, 20 armed men rode in. They claimed to be Federal soldiers. They were not. They were Confederate veterans from General Vaughan's Tennessee Cavalry, men who had escorted Davis for weeks and knew exactly what was in those wagons, men who had not been paid for months and had apparently decided that if the Confederacy was finished, its gold was fair game. Witnesses said the bandits waded knee-deep in coins in the road. They filled bags and sacks and loaded their horses. Then, because the gold was too heavy to carry all at once, they started hiding it. Coin bags in hollow trees, containers sunk in ponds, bundles buried in gullies along the road. About $250,000 in gold and silver was taken that night. Roughly $111,000 was eventually recovered by federal authorities. The rest was never officially accounted for. Treasure hunters have been digging up the fields of Lincoln County, Georgia ever since. The third answer involves the $86,000 given to Semple and Tidball. Semple never delivered it to England. Instead, he spent the following 2 years traveling across the eastern United States, using portions of the gold to fund the Fenian Brotherhood, an Irish-American revolutionary organization planning to invade Canada and provoke a war between Britain and America, which Semple somehow believed might help the Confederacy. He burned through the money on political schemes that went nowhere. Tidball made a simpler choice. He was seen heading north from Georgia days after receiving the gold in the company of a Confederate judge and a paroled officer. He returned to Winchester, Virginia. He built a large house. He became a respected citizen. He was elected to the Virginia House of Delegates in 1872. Historians who have examined Tidball's post-war life note that his prosperity appears considerably greater than what a former government clerk with no obvious source of income should have been able to afford. Neither man ever fully explained where the $86,000 went. The fourth answer is the one that still keeps treasure hunters awake at night. 39 kegs of Mexican silver, 9,000 pounds, buried somewhere near Danville, Virginia, in the spring of 1865. By every measure of logistics and historical evidence, those kegs went into the ground. The men who buried them are long dead. The location was never recorded, or if it was, the record has not survived. Danville, Virginia still sits above whatever may or may not be beneath it. In 1867, Congress passed a law declaring that all Confederate treasury funds, wherever found, are the legal property of the United States government. Legally, any Confederate gold discovered today belongs to the federal government. This has not stopped treasure hunters, but it explains why anyone who does find something might choose not to report it. Pieces have turned up over the years. In the 1940s, a logging crew in Georgia found a Mexican silver coin near a spot where Davis's party was known to have camped. A researcher named William Rawlings examined the coin himself. It dated to the 1850s, consistent with the Confederate Treasury's Mexican silver holdings. Small numbers of gold coins with suggestive histories have appeared in private collections. Local families in Lincoln County and Wilkes County, Georgia, have passed down stories for generations. An ancestor who came home from the war with gold he would not explain. A field where coins turned up every time the ground was plowed. The litigation over the recovered portions of the Richmond bank funds dragged through American courts for 28 years. On June 22, 1893, a federal court awarded the Richmond banks $16,987 in compensation. The remaining $78,276 of recovered funds was ruled the property of the United States. The rest was never recovered. When you strip away the legend and look only at verified history, here is what you actually know. About $775,000 in hard currency left Richmond on April 2, 1865. Documented disbursements along the route south account for a large portion of the Confederate Treasury funds. The Chenol Plantation robbery on May 24, 1865, took approximately $250,000 of the bank reserves, of which roughly $111,000 was recovered. The $86,000 given to Semple and Tidball never reached England, and both men lived notably comfortable lives without ever accounting for it. 39 kegs of Mexican silver almost certainly went into the ground near Danville, Virginia, and have never been officially found. The gap between what left Richmond and what was officially accounted for is probably somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000. That is where the legend lives. The story of the Confederate gold endures because it is not really a treasure story. It is the story of an ending, told through the journey of a few crates of coins moving by train and wagon through the collapse of a nation. Every disbursement from those crates was a surrender, the payment to Johnston's soldiers, the coins scattered to Davis's escort on the last day of the Confederate government, the gold hidden in a carriage headed for an England that would never see it, and at the end of it, a man in a Georgia swamp, a woman's shawl, a few dollars. Somewhere in Virginia, there may still be 9,000 pounds of silver beneath the ground. Somewhere in the fields of Georgia, coin bags may still be rotting in the earth where desperate men hid them on a dark night in May 1865. Or all of it is simply gone, scattered across the post-war South one coin at a time, held by families who knew where it came from and kept quiet about it for generations until even the knowledge was lost. 160 years later, we still do not know. And that open door, that unresolved question, is exactly why the story refuses to die.